What's up, you guys? This is Devin with CenturyFX Studios, back with another video, and today we're going to be talking about the Canon T8i. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Canon T8i is, it's an entry-level, mid-level type body. It's kind of like a mix in between the two. It's not completely bare bones, but it's an entry-level camera with a little bit step up on the functions. Like, if you can spend a little bit more money than $500, this is probably the camera you're going with. Now, this camera retails usually around $800, $900, depending on whether or not you buy it with a lens or not. Now, typically people are buying this with a lens because this is usually the camera they come in with. They buy into this camera. Now, when I first started, one of the first cameras I had were two Rebels. It wasn't both of them at the same time, but the first one was the XTI with I think it had a CF card on it, and it was like 8 megapixels at most, and I learned a lot on that camera. Now, I stepped up later to the 15 megapixel T8i, and I did so many pictures on that camera. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pictures on that camera. I know alone I was shooting like 1,000 pictures when I went out to New York. So I'm pretty sure I did like 100,000 pictures on that camera itself. But the Rebel series is so powerful to the Canon brand. And I have to mention this because you have to understand where Canon has been with the Rebel series and where it's going. Now, my friend told me that he used to have a Rebel film camera, and the Rebel brand is so strong that medium to entry-level base, that brand is so strong in Canon that in the 80s and 90s they were killing it. Tennis players were pretty much endorsing and advertising this model of Canon. You don't really ever see tennis players or sports players endorsing a camera at all, but Canon had it back in the day in the late 80s and early 90s. I think it was Andre Agassi who was actually used in an ad to help promote the Rebel series brand. And that's crazy to me because you never see anything like that today because cameras aren't as popular as cell phones are. You probably see a famous person advertising a cell phone more than you would see advertising an actual camera. All right, so you got the T8i. This camera is essentially a plateau or a landmark for almost all the Rebel T8i series cameras before it, and the reason is because it has so many different things. All right, first you have to understand I'm not sponsored by Canon. I only main with Canon, but I also shoot with Panasonic, Nikon, Sony cameras as well. All these cameras are useful for different things, but I main with Canon and my lenses come from a Canon base. Now you have to understand it's a Canon camera. It is solid. It's gonna work wherever you want it to work. It's robust. It got a nice menu system, and that pretty much helps Canon sell these cameras to people who don't really know cameras. When you get to Nikons, you start to see a lot of buttons, and the buttons are there. It's okay. They don't have a whole bunch of buttons everywhere, but it's still a decent amount of buttons in weird places, like around the lenses and stuff like that. Even though it makes you look pro, it might not sell to the younger crowd. And then the Nikon menus are like the second worst in the higher end camera industry when it comes to the three big giant camera brands. Now, the camera brand that's worse on menu systems is Sony. So when people get into the cameras, they're like, okay, I need to change this. But they got to go through all these weirdly worded phrases that you should already know based off of a Canon or a Nikon background or any other camera background, because that's what people are used to. Even if they don't have a DSLR, they probably had a Canon smaller point and shoot camera at some time, or a Nikon point and shoot camera sometimes. So this T8i is just furthering Canon's great menu system, robust quality, and easy to use features. And there's features pretty much everywhere on this camera. Now, the next thing we need to get into is another good thing that they added to this camera, which is the AF on button. Now, for those of you who have used the AF on button, you're probably in the higher series D cameras like the 7D, the 80D, the 5D, and the 1D series. These all have the AF on buttons, and you might be saying to yourself, if you haven't seen this, what is the AF on button and why is it so important? Tony Northrup made this video on back button focus, and it was on cameras that had primitive focusing systems like the 5D Mark II and things of that nature. So if you are having trouble using those limited focusing points like 9 focusing points or 11 focusing points, you are able to track your subject a lot better by decoupling or taking away the ability to focus from the shutter button and putting it on another button. So it could be focused on something else while whenever you want to release that shutter, you can. Have you ever put your lens in manual mode and hit that shutter button and it worked to your surprise, even though the picture might have came out bad? Well, that's the same concept. Decoupling that shutter button from the autofocus function helps you focus and shoot without the camera having to focus and shoot at the same time, because every time you hit that front shutter button, usually it's defaulted to focus, auto expose, and then release the shutter. But if all those conditions aren't met, the camera will slow down, it will slug up, and when you're shooting in photography, every second counts. So therein lies the back button focus button. It's an awesome tool to use, and I really think it should have been on T8i cameras, T7i, T6i, T6s, all these other cameras that came out recently. It probably should have been in there a long time ago, considering that the bigger board cameras already have it. All right, and we also have what we call the aperture wheel. Now, again, going back from the 7Ds, the 6Ds, the 5D Mark 4s and 5D series and the 1D series, we have this aperture wheel. This is one of Canon's, I would say, polarizing features. Like when you look at the camera, a lot of people are like, why does this thing keep spinning? Why does this keep spinning? Well, Canon users tend to get used to it, and it becomes a Canon thing. Like Canon's one of the only cameras that has this spinny knob on the back, and it never stops. And then some of the cheaper cameras or the older cameras had a set button that would go around. But this rotary dial, or this rotating dial for your aperture, was always fun to use for me, because I would rotate the aperture and rotate the shutter up front. Now, you didn't have to move your finger away or your face away from the camera to then hold an AV button and turn another button at the same time like you have to do on your Rebel series. I remember on the T8i, T2i, T3i, T4i, T5i, T6i, T6s, T7i, all had this feature where you had to hold the AV button down or the aperture value button down and then turn something at the same time. It was kind of a lock-on, lock-off mechanism, but you had to use two fingers, and that takes away from your ability to take a picture, and that's not something that I liked. But I got used to it with the T8i. Once I got the 7D, I never went back to that functionality. So having an aperture wheel that actually has all of this on it, or it's just like the bigger daddy cameras, it's just something that we should have had before. Now we have it. All right, now you have a simplified mode dial for the T8i, and I love this because a lot of people nowadays tend to go to the running man mode, the portrait face mode, the flower close-up mode, and all this other stuff, and it confuses the mess out of my students. Anytime my student comes up to me, they're like, oh, I'm in running man mode, or I'm in this mode, or I'm in this mode with a picture, and this mode with a picture. I'm in landscape mode, I'm in sports mode. Please get out of those modes, because those modes are just catered for you to be a little bit lazier as a photographer. You never stop to think about certain things. Now you already have semi-automatic modes. Chances are, if you bought this camera, this new T8i, you're spending $700, $800 for a camera. You spending $700, $800 for a camera, you're probably spending $100 to $300 for a lens. That's $1,000 for your entire camera setup. And you mean to tell me you want the camera to do everything, and you know technology, well, you should know that technology is not all that awesome, especially with iPhones and things of that nature. It never always gives you what you want. So if you're going to spend $1,000 on a camera system, you need to be able to take some control of that camera system to get what you want, because you don't want to think to yourself and say, oh, I got this camera for $1,000 and it's barely giving me what I want. No, you need to start taking control of your camera. I'm always a big advocate of that. You need to actually spend some time working on yourself, and that's why I like the simplified mode dial, because you don't look for face mode. You don't look for creative auto. I don't even think it has an auto mode. It might have an auto mode on this, but just like your 6D series, your 7D series, your 5D series, and your 1D series, all these cameras don't have any of those picture scene modes where it chooses what it thinks you want, and pretty much strips down your ability to use flashes to your maximum capability. It strips down your ability to use anything that the camera was designed to be used for. So it just picks out what it thinks you want, and it might be wrong, and you're okay with that. And I hate that mentality. Take control of your camera. Manual mode, maybe some shutter priority, maybe some aperture priority, maybe some program mode if you can't get it. It may be some auto mode, but definitely manual mode. Okay, another thing that's great, and it shows that Canon's paying attention to the times, is vertical video mode. I never really think about this as a feature inside of a camera, because then you have to come from the camera and go straight to the computer, where, you know, your cell phone, you can just do it on your cell phone and call it a day. Yes, it's kind of shining some light back on to the T8i, but I doubt, based on, you know, the recording and how big these files are going to be coming from the T8i, that it's going to move really well to the Instagram or any other medium that's social media. It might work out, who knows? Maybe the technology has really gotten there with Canon and they can move this vertical video straight from your camera to some kind of a medium like Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, whatever. But it might not work like you think, and it's specifically for Instagram, because Instagram has been so popular with the video and Instagram TV and all this other stuff. But I digress. I don't know if this will be a good video function and people are going to use it as much, but it's there, and it looks like Canon's thinking about new things. Dual pixel autofocus, eye detection. I don't know a lot about this, and I don't want to look too deep into it. I'd rather get the camera in my hands with a dual pixel eye detection autofocus, because as you all know, the EOS R with the firmware update has now come out with the eye tracking autofocus. Just like Sony is like, oh well, Sony's doing it, we should probably get on and do it. Yes, it's not as good as Sony, I heard, but it's good and people are happy with it. But it's definitely something you would have to put in your hands based off of what you're shooting. If you're shooting sports and things of that nature, if it's anything like the 1DX Mark III, based off of what Jared Pollan did, I think that it's going to be great. I think it's going to be a great addition to the Rebel series of cameras. Now that specs are trickling down, like I always say, but it might not be as good as you think. It's something you got to have in your hands. Now, this is where probably a lot of Canon fanboys are going to get mad at me, and I'm a Canon fanboy a little bit, but you have to understand that Canon is giving us essentially the same camera, just with some upgrades that we probably already wanted. And let's get into what's the same. And the 24 megapixel sensor is essentially the same. A lot of people are like, oh no, Devin, it's 24.1 megapixels instead of 24.2 megapixels that were in the last T7i. I was like, okay, so this is the T8i, you give us less megapixels. Wait, but the less megapixels helps with the video, because the video is not going to be pixel banning a lot. It's going to help because 24 megapixels is not necessarily 4K at the maximum resolution. Oh, okay. If you say it's going to look better for the video for you to lose that 0.1 megapixels, but it's essentially still the same 24 megapixels. But 24 megapixels, have you heard that before with the Canon end? Yes, you've heard that before in the Canon end. For example, 24 megapixels has been in the M100, the T7, the SL3, the M50, the M200, the 77D, the 80D, the T6i, T6s, T7i, the SL2, the M3, the M5, the M6, and also just a little tidbit from the full frame angle. The 6D Mark II, the EOS RP, they both have 26 megapixels. So they're pretty much, with a decent lens, going to be around the same price used. So, you know, 6D Mark II, EOS RP. EOS RP might be a better choice because you're getting into the mirrorless world, but the mirrorless lenses are super expensive, but they're some of the best in the world. The 60 Mark II does fail at, 4K. It doesn't have 4K, but it's still a great camera. It's going to have better image quality in your pictures than the T8i. Okay, you might be saying, oh, well, Devin, they need 24 megapixels because nobody really needs anything over 24 megapixels, this, that, and the other. There's no reason why they should be really yoking up the megapixels. It's not that big of a deal. Okay, I understand. It takes up a lot of memory. You'd be better off having a camera better in low light. But it had this new Digic 8 processor. I don't know if it's that big of a difference in low light. It's definitely something you got to test out, but it's probably just a small incremental change. It's probably not that big of a change in low light and dynamic range as far as how high you can push your ISOs or how much shadow and highlight detail you're going to be able to get out of this camera. How is this T8i not just an 80D without 4K? I'm waiting. It's an 80D without 4K, and we thought the 80D was going to have 4K. Why? Because the 70D was so popular. The double-digit D series cameras, the ones that are supposed to be the intermediate ones, we thought that the 80D was supposed to have 4K because the 70D really capitalized on the dual pixel autofocus. dual pixel autofocus coupled with 4K would have been great. You know what I'm saying? Well, yeah, Devin, Canon's a little bit late on the 4K, but at least we got it in the 90D. Yes, we did get it in the 90D, but the 90D had to take a year or two, maybe even 3 years to come out after the 80D, and it was still kind of long in the tooth because I'm pretty sure there's some stipulations that you got to understand that the sooner Canon can implement some of these things, the more likely they are to continue to implement and sharpen up on these things. I'm not asking them to have a 16K video sensor, and I'm not even asking them to have an 8K video sensor. I'm trying to get Canon to master what they already have. So if you have a 4K sensor and it came out in 2012, I'm looking at you, the 1DC. The 1DC is a cinema camera that came out in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, and that's almost 9 years ago. Look up Philip Bloom's video on the 1DC. It's an amazing video, but you have a camera that came out 8 years ago with 4K, but Canon never really sharpened it up or even re-implemented it in any of their cameras until you get it to what, the 5D Mark IV and the 1DX Mark II, I believe. And even when it came out with that, it still had the same long in the tooth, hard to use motion JPEG, which a lot of people couldn't use or couldn't. Our software, Premiere Pros or Final Cuts, couldn't even actually mess with it all that much because it was such a different type of file format. It wasn't your MP4s or your MOVs. But I digress. Okay, y'all brought 4K back. It's still an 80D without 4K. And then on top of that, there's no dual pixel autofocus in 4K for the T8i. It's just contrast detect autofocus, which makes me cringe a little bit more because it's like, okay, didn't we already go through this with like the M50 or one of those mirrorless cameras that you guys don't really care about because you don't make lenses for anymore? So it would make it even longer to tube. So even if Canon implemented 4K in a mirrorless camera that was a crop frame mirrorless camera, they didn't invest a lot of money into the lenses. So even if we would have bought that camera, we wouldn't have been able to use that 4K because we didn't have that many focal distances. And then they cropped the 4K. Okay, so you're going to wait till the last minute to give me 4K. Panasonic had already came out with 4K in their smaller cameras, their Micro Four Thirds. I'm using the G7 right now. That's an example. A $400 camera, by the way. But you wait until the last minute on 4K, then you bring it out and crop it. All right. Then you crop it on the full frame cameras, which is not that bad because you can actually use an APS-C sensor. I think Max Urev made a really good video on using the 18 to 35 millimeter fast glass from Sigma to use on the 5D Mark IV to make that 4K a little bit wider at a usable distance. But, okay, you crop the 4K, and then you bring out the T8i with a whole bunch of specs that we probably should have had already on the Ti series, because this camera comes out every 1 to 2 years, depending on which camera you're talking about. And maybe 3 years at the most, they'll push this camera cycle, but T9i is coming out in, 2 years maybe? This camera comes out all the time. And since it comes out so much, it's easy for Canon just to make the same camera. You know what I'm saying, Devin, you're just giving me a load of crap. You give me a load of crap. No, I'm giving it to you straight, guys. Think about the 18 megapixel sensor that was in the T8i. The T8i came out with the 18 megapixel sensor. They kept making that same 18 megapixel sensor camera for the T2i, T3i, T4i, T5i. And then they changed it with the T6i, but that's almost like 6 to 7 years worth of a camera that still has the same sensor. Yeah, they upgraded it with some flippy screens and stuff like that. But think about Canon. Canon is a camera company. They don't just have DSLRs and all these other cameras. They have the point and shoot, not point and shoots. Well, they have point and shoots, yeah, but they have point and shoots. They have camcorders. All these cameras more than likely have a flip out screen. The XC10, all these cameras, now they're designed for video, yes, but with the amount of money that we're paying for some of these cameras to not have some of these usable functions in a selfie age, in a vlogging age where we want to see ourselves on the back of a monitor, it's kind of long in the tooth.